Hey class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are moving now into chapter 11 on this topic of gender and behavior. So we're going to be looking at sort of studying the differences and behavior, characteristics, psychological characteristics, behavior, things like that in terms of gender. So we're going to start off by looking at stereotypes. So by the end of this section, you'll be able to explain the nature of gender stereotypes, where do they come from, their connection with instrumentality, how we typically perceive males, and expressiveness, how we typically perceive females in terms of gender. And when I say gender, and when I talk about male, female, I'm very aware that gender is more or is less binary than we once thought. It's not just male, female, black, white, 1-0 binary. There's fluidity to it. But just for the sake of conversation, a lot of times I'm going to kind of use some of those binary terms, at least just for the understanding of looking at generalities. So you'll also be able to discuss the 4 important points about gender stereotypes. So important terms when it comes to kind of some table setting things when it comes to gender. One, gender is the state of being male or female, but again, there's fluidity to that. It's not just being strictly male, strictly female. We understand that there's more nuance to that. So, you can be, there's percentages, perhaps even it's, you could be mostly male, but there may be part of your characteristics that identify as female, and I mean, again, that's not suggesting that that person would be transgender by any means. It just means that I think we understand there's more fluidity in how we think about this term of gender now. Stereotypes, obviously, these are shortcuts in the way we think. These are beliefs about gender in terms of what it means to be male and female, what certain abilities or personality traits or social behavior we ascribe to being, quote unquote male or quote unquote female. And typically when we think about explaining male traits versus female, we typically describe males along the lines of instrumentality. It's this orientation towards action, accomplishment, basically getting stuff done. And these are things we typically associate with masculine or male traits. Whereas for female, it's more about expressiveness, expressing emotions, expressing relationships. And those are, more about, instead of or walking the walk, it's more about talking the talk, I suppose, if you wanted to kind of sum it up succinctly. So, here's some important concepts: gender differences, actual differences, disparities, based on actual observations, research observations, not like perceived stereotypes that may or may not even exist. Gender roles, these are expectations about, how males and females are intended to behave in society. Your state of being male, female, gender, that fluidity will also inform your identity, sort of what traits that are expressed, masculine, female, your sense of being masculine or female, and not necessarily all. I mean, these are not the same concepts, but sexual orientation and gender, there's overlap, but they are not the same thing. Sexual orientation has more to do with your preference of who you choose to engage in romantic or sexual relationships with. And sometimes there's correlation in terms of gender, but I mean, not really. These are related terms, but obviously not the same. Typically, when we think about stereotypical characteristics, like for, characteristics that are quote unquote masculine or male, active, competitive, really good at numbers like math, strong, self-confident. Whereas for the feminine, female traits might be more artistic or creative or emotional or kind or, taking care of the house, taking care of children, things like that. And we'll talk about where those things come from. But it's really important in terms of gender stereotypes, like there is variability even within those stereotypes of how we think about males, females, and those things are kind of influencing how we think about race, socioeconomic status, really just identity in general. The lines in terms of like clear line of demarcation of, being male, female, those roles, those expectations have become far less rigid over the last probably 30, 40 years, most of my lifetime. We're seeing those boundaries, they're becoming more blurred rather than definitive. But we still live, at least in American society, where male stereotypes tend to be more complementary. The sort of androcentrism, really kind of looking at the world from a male perspective as if that is the norm, which is kind of funny because there are more females, at least in American society, there are more females than males. So, I mean, males are definitely in the minority on this, but yet the sort of thinking would maybe have you believe otherwise. So here's sort of here's some of the gender stereotypical thinking in terms of this comic here. You have the thinker. If it's a male, it's a thinker, but if it's female, it's the worrier. She's concerned, maybe concerned about relationships, concerned about other things. So it depends on who's doing the thinking, I suppose, as the comic would allude to. So now we're going to look at gender similarities and differences, and I'll just go ahead and give you a spoiler. There are far more similarities than differences, and the differences that do exist are pretty, minute. So we're going to first look at how meta-analyses have helped researchers study gender. Basically, meta-analyses are the main method of research methodology that we're going to talk about for how we understand gender differences. You'll be able to articulate the gender similarities hypothesis, summarize the research on gender similarities and differences in verbal, mathematical, and spatial abilities, understand the research on gender similarities and differences in terms of personality, social behavior, psychological disorders, and give 2 explanations for why gender differences appear larger than they actually are. They're perhaps overstated. So the first thing to introduce is this idea of a meta-analysis. And this is a statistical procedure where you are combining the results of many different studies on the same topic. So maybe finding all of the similar studies that individual scientists and teams of researchers have done about the topic of gender similarity, and then finding a way to statistically kind of compute everything together so we get a very big picture of what's happening here. Because each individual paper and author will have their statistics, but you're basically using a meta-analysis as a way to kind of analyze all the data collectively. And along those lines, kind of looking at the research, looking at the findings along gender similarities, there is a hypothesis that states pretty clearly men and women are more similar on most psychological variables. When there are differences, they are small and tend to be overstated. The exaggerated differences, they are overstated. However, they do have real impacts on the workplace and also the relationship. So even though they are minimal, the differences are minimal, they have real world consequences. So let's not kid ourselves there. First, let's start off with cognitive abilities. What's going on between our ears. Overall, in terms of intelligence, research shows there's no gender differences. However, when we break down intelligence and look at specific cognitive abilities, then we can start to see some subtle differences. But again, those differences are perhaps minimal and more overstated. So for the most part, in terms of verbal ability, girls tend to start speaking sooner than males, and they tend to have larger vocabularies, better reading scores. Boys tend to fare better on verbal analogies, but are 3 to 4 times more likely to stutter and 5 to 10 times more likely to suffer from dyslexia. Breaking it out into mathematical abilities. Recent meta-analyses have showed that there are no longer gender differences in general mathematical performance. There's a lot of stereotypes that females are just not as good at math, but the data just doesn't really show that. There are exceptions, however. Males have a more positive attitude towards math, and by the time they reach high school, boys start to outperform girls in complex math problem solving. Males tend to outperform females at the high end of the distribution. But again, this is not, there's so many other factors that go into it, just simply being male or being female. So we need to be really careful about how we interpret those results. We also see, in terms of the ratio of males to females in terms of mathematics courses, we see that shrinking. There are more and more female students taking math classes, taking higher math classes. And ultimately, I think by putting more females in classroom settings like that, you're going to see increases, for example, in self-esteem or positive attitude towards math. And that any degree of gap is just going to continue narrowing, getting smaller. Continue with mathematical abilities. The patterns typically emerge late. So these differences are most likely due to socialization. Like if you socially push boys towards careers and courses that involve mathematics and have them take more math courses, then they're probably going to have a more positive attitude versus if you have, female students, you're pushing them towards other careers and majors and coursework. In terms of spatial abilities, be able to navigate the world spatially. There are gender differences in terms of spatial difference. The largest, though, is the ability to perceive and mentally manipulate shapes and figures. And in this area, males consistently outperform females in the ability to perform mental rotation. So something like this, being able to mentally rotate, this object to look like this object or vice versa. Males tend to outperform. But again, a lot of that has to do with socialization. For example, playing video games would have a lot to do with your ability to do this. And typically males are more encouraged to play video games. I'm not saying that video games causes this by any means, but it's things like that kind of help us understand what's happening here. Looking at personality traits, social behavior, in terms of self-esteem, meta-analyses research shows that females score somewhat lower than males on measures of overall self-esteem, but it kind of makes sense. We do live in a world that's sort of androcentric, as I mentioned earlier, so maybe that is a possible explanation. There's no support for dramatic drop of girls' self-esteem during adolescence. And the differences in self-esteem may not necessarily apply to all ethnic groups. That maybe some ethnic groups feel it more than others or less than others. So we need to be careful. We need to flesh that result out even further. Another personality trait, which is aggression. A definition of aggression from psychology standpoint is any kind of behavior that's intended to hurt somebody. It can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be social, but you're trying to get one over on somebody. There aren't necessarily differences in terms of are males more aggressive than females, but there are differences in terms of the form that aggression takes. Both males and females can be aggressive, but consistently the research shows that males tend to be much more physical and verbal in terms of their aggression. And also their aggression is more associated with crime. We can look at the rates of crime, for example, violent crimes, rape, sexual assault, murder, robbery, all of these, really all violent crimes, if you want to go to the bottom. I mean, you look at the numbers, almost above 90% in most cases, we're talking about males committing these kinds of crimes. Doesn't mean that there aren't women who don't do these things, but it's far more likely. But in terms of aggression that females are more likely to engage in, it's more likely to be relational aggression, hurting someone's feelings, giving someone the silent treatment, shunning somebody from a friend group. I think of Mean Girls, like Regina George, kicking somebody out of the friend group. Indirect aggression, I guess this is more Mean Girls, like spreading rumors about somebody, you're not necessarily confronting them directly, but you're kind of, attacking them, being aggressive to them on the fringes. In terms of sexual attitudes, what are the differences or similarities in terms of how different genders perceive sex and their attitude towards sex? It's some research, really interesting research from Peter and Hyde from 2010 that find that men are slightly more likely to engage in sexual activity, have more sexual partners, and tend to have a more permissive attitude about sex. And men are also more likely to engage in casual sex, use pornography, masturbate, whereas women are more likely to be socialized to feel guilty and shame in terms of response to engaging in sex. What about emotional expression? We oftentimes hear that women are the more emotional of the two genders, and males are the more stoic. And the research shows women are more likely to express emotion, but women and men experience emotions equally. It's not as if males are dull to certain emotion and women are not. I mean, they're both feeling these emotions, but women are typically, are taught, hey, it's okay to express these things. They're also, that are able to recognize emotions through certain cues like facial expressions and nonverbal cues, body language. What about communication? Men tend to talk and interrupt more than women, despite that stereotype. It's a pretty nasty stereotype that women are the one who talk and interrupt, but it turns out the research shows otherwise. When women have more power at work or in relationships, when the relationships tend to be more equal, they're more likely to interrupt. Who interrupts whom also depends on the status, their social status, socioeconomic status, all of those different things. And and men tend to have more status, at least socially. So that's probably more of an explanation. What about psychological disorders? Men are more likely to experience alcoholism and substance abuse. Women are more likely to experience depression, anxiety. Females also tend to show higher rates of eating disorders linked to things like body image, distorted body image. We live in a society, especially American society, Western society, where thin is in. It's kind of the end all be all, and that can have a pretty dramatic effect on how people perceive their own bodies, and females tend to be affected by that more so than men. We are seeing this thin is affecting specifically groups like white and Asian American females, but also we're starting to see those trends are showing up with other racial ethnic groups and males as well. But let's put gender differences in perspective. We just talked a lot about differences, but for the most part, these differences are quite small and perhaps even overstated. The gender, for example, accounts for there are individual differences between people. We can't deny that, but gender is such a small difference in the grand scheme of things. When gender differences are found, that does not mean that one gender is necessarily better than the other. It has probably a lot more to do with socialization and the way our society is structured, more so than quote unquote one being better than the other. But this is what I mean by similarities and differences. If we have distributions of females, here in the orange, we have distributions of male in this purplish bluish category here. There's so much overlap. This is the similarity. Yes, there is a difference. There are some differences there, but that's probably much more overstated, and the similarities are far too understated. So putting it into perspective, some of those differences do seem larger. However, thinking about social role theory, basically the idea that each individual or each gender has sort of a part to play within the structure of society, sort of gets exaggerated. Those differences get exaggerated. Differences also seem larger according to another theory, social constructionism theory. We construct realities based on societal expectations. Like if we have certain expectations about how men and women are to behave and to act and progress and advance in society, if anything goes against that, we may kind of change the narrative around to kind of fit in our own expectations. Okay, what about biological origins of differences? After this section, you'll be able to summarize evolutionary explanations for gender differences, review the evidence linking gender differences and cognitive abilities to brain organization, and describe the evidence relating to hormones and gender differences. We do see gender differences in many cultures. It's not just the United States. It's not just the Western world. Evolutionary psychologists offer an interesting perspective. They argue, for example, that those differences come from a time typically long in our ancestral past, and where there were different demands were placed on males and females in terms of our survival. Everything about evolutionary psychology is about promoting survival. So, for example, aggression typically favored in males their ability to compete for certain mates, like being more aggressive, being physically dominant, for example, likely allowed you to survive and keep the species going. And then also the spatial skills in terms of if you lived in a hunting and gathering society, developing those fine-tuned spatial skills to be able to kind of see prey, hidden prey, that could be the difference between living and surviving and keeping your family, alive and keep your genes going or not. So this is really offering kind of a hindsight perspective on trying to explain behaviors now based on the past. So in terms of the brain organization, we do know hopefully from previous chapters in this course in intro psych that we have two hemispheres. You have your left and your right hemisphere of the brain. Your left hemisphere is typically more associated with verbal and mathematical processes, where the right hemisphere is specialized in visual spatial skills, nonverbal processes. We tend to see more specialization in cerebral specialization, left versus right, in males. Typically speaking, males are more likely to depend heavily on the right hemisphere for visual spatial tasks and the left hemisphere for verbal tasks. Females typically have a larger corpus callosum, that bundle of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres together. And this allows for greater hemisphere communication and makes it, more of a whole brain, takes more of the whole brain when completing similar tasks and able to communicate faster. So here's just a picture, the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum. Not a great depiction of the corpus callosum, but you could imagine a bundle of fibers connecting these two portions here. In terms of the limitations and thinking about brain organization and how we explain gender differences, findings are inconsistent. I mean, we could, a lot of times we're talking about case studies here. We're not talking about a wide, always a lot of sample size to look at these things. Differences in socialization do occur as developmental changes happen in the brain are emerging. and environmental experiences shape the brain. So it's kind of, it's really like the chicken or the egg. We don't know which is, we're not quite sure the direction of the relationship. The type of the task matters that we're evaluating the differences on. Overall, the research shows that male and female brains are more similar than they are different. There's much more overlap than there is differences. Another physical explanation in terms of where differences comes from hormones. Remember, our body has two forms of communicating. The fast way is the nervous system. The slower way is our endocrine system, which produces hormones, these chemical substances that are released in the bloodstream. We do see, for example, prenatal gender differentiation is a reflection of hormones. The hormones that are being developed and during in utero have a powerful influence on the brain before birth. And also, the exposure to these things will determine which sort of traits, masculine, feminine traits develop. So the exposure to male hormones, for example, ends up leading to the development of masculine traits, mental abilities, choice of toys, things like that. So development in terms of gender starts to happen even before a child even leaves the womb. There's also the relationship to aggression. Testosterone is the hormone that is related to aggression. It's also linked to sexual desire in both men and women. Researchers are still sort of exploring the relationship between aggressive behavior and testosterone. So far, the results are inconclusive, but aggressive behavior can also kind of lead to increases in testosterone. So again, it's one of those things we're not quite sure. Does testosterone lead to more aggression? Does aggression lead to more testosterone? Probably both are true to some extent. So we're overall, though, thinking about influences, hormones, nervous system, all that. It's really unclear how a large role of our biology plays in gender differences. Also considering because we're so incredibly similar on a biological level. So that's the biological side, the nature side of things. What about nurture? The environmental differences or environmental origins of gender differences. You should be able to define socialization and gender roles, explain how reinforcement and punishment, observational learning, and self-socialization operate, and how we gender role socialize. Describe how parents, peers, schools, and the media serve as sources of gender role socialization. So socialization is just simply, how we learn how we are expected to behave in society. This is something we acquire ideally, from maybe our parents, our teachers, maybe older siblings. So we are socialized how to act in society. And with that, there are also gender roles that are socialized, expectations about what is appropriate depending on your gender. And the question we're going to look at here is how are gender roles acquired within our culture. Because there are certain processes that we've talked about in previous sections that can be used to understand gender role socialization. One of those processes is reinforcement and punishment, or operant conditioning. Gender roles or the development of those roles are shaped by consequences. Parents, for example, provide approval or disapproval for behaviors they consider gender appropriate or gender inappropriate. If it's a little boy is playing with action figures and army men and things like that, mom and dad might be say, hey, that's great, that's wonderful. But if he picked up a Barbie doll, maybe they say, oh, that's for girls and you shouldn't play with that. Again, really reinforcing pretty quickly like what behaviors are tolerated and what are not. Parents and fathers specifically are much less tolerant of gender inappropriate behavior, especially if their sons are engaging in behavior that's typically considered feminine. You're more likely to see pushback from dad. Another place that we learn gender role socialization is by observing other people. We've talked about observational learning previously. You learned about it in introductory psych. This is where we learn from observing models, like a role model, for example. This is all part of the social cognitive theory from Bandura, that we just soak things up. We're like sponges. Young children are like sponges, and they imitate same gender adults. Like little boys are very likely to imitate their fathers. Little girls very likely to imitate their mothers, assuming you're living in a household with both. So it makes sense. You're more likely to imitate someone who's like you. Also, self-socialization. Some children just learn it on their own around 2 to 3 years. Children identify themselves. This is when they start to identify themselves as either being male, being female. They might also start to organize their world along those gender lines. Maybe that's like the friends they start hanging out with, the toys they start selecting, things like that. They start to develop pretty obvious signs of gender schemas, structures for how they see the world in terms of gender. Another area of socialization comes from parents. Parents are the first agent of socialization in a child's life. There's a lot of research that looks at this. Meta-analysis of 172 studies show that gender, or parents, are the one that encourage play activities that are, considered gender appropriate or inappropriate. Boys tend to have less leeway to act feminine, whereas girls have more leeway to act, quote unquote masculine, maybe in terms of the toys they select. Picture books that parents buy for their children also tend to reflect gender stereotypical activities. The next agent of socialization when children go to school are their peers. Around 4 to 6, children tend to separate into same gender groups. Boys start hanging out more exclusively with boys, girls with girls. Play also starts to take different forms for boys and girls. Boys and girls tend to be critical of children who violate traditional gender norms. They start to reinforce and punish each other. It's not just their parents, they're doing it themselves now. If in a kindergarten class, if there's a little boy in a kindergarten class who acts more feminine than masculine, there's a chance he might be ridiculed by his peers or made fun of or called out for violating those traditional norms. Schools overall are an agent of socialization, whether it's teachers, principals, etc. There are biases in how children are treated. Teachers treat children differently depending on whether they're boys or girls. Typically speaking, boys are given more attention, more help, more praise, and also given more scolding. They're just given more reinforcement in general. There is a gender bias also in terms of academic and career counseling. For example, males are more likely to be advised to go into math or STEM fields, pursue higher status career, even when we take into account that females have higher grades. There's that bias that still exists to some extent. The media is also an agent of socialization. Movies, TV shows, Netflix, Hulu, all that fun stuff. Females typically, the data shows females appear less often in TV, less likely to be employed, more likely to be younger, more likely to appear in secondary and comedy roles when they're on TV. Males are often shown as competent, reaching goals, and being more genuine, or being more resourceful, I should say, ingenuity, demonstrating more ingenuity. TV commercials are especially more likely to emphasize traditional gender roles. If you see a commercial about cleaning products, it's more likely to have a female as the center of the commercial. If you see a commercial about trucks, you're more likely to see a male at the center of that commercial. American children also, we watch a lot of TV. I'm not an American child, I should say, but Americans in general, we watch a lot of TV. Same with American children. The relationship shows those who watch TV typically hold more stereotype views in regards to gender than those who watch less. You're being influenced whether you know it or not. TV commercials, as I mentioned earlier, also put a lot of content out that's pretty stereotypical in terms of gender lines, so reinforcing some of those beliefs. If you look at the types of commercials, boys only in terms of their commercials, it's more likely to revolve around transportation, action figures, sports, things like that. For girls, a big chunk of it's going to be dolls and then animals. I mean, almost, almost 90% of this we're talking about is related to dolls and animals. Okay, gender role expectations. After this section, you'll be able to list the key elements of traditional male role and identify common problems associated with that role, list the major expectations of the female role, and identify some of the common problems associated with the female role. The 5 kind of expectations we attribute for being male: achievement, aggression, autonomy, sexuality, and stoicism. Like the stoicism meaning you're like the Gary Cooper, the strong, silent type. Achievement meaning you get good grades, you got a good job. Aggression, you're not afraid to take risks. Autonomy, you make your own choices. Sexuality, you're thinking about sexual conquest. Women are prizes to be had, so to speak. I mean, these are all. Hopefully, you can already understand how this is problematic. There's higher pressure to succeed. This is one of the big problems of that that male expectation, that role. It might create more stress. This is also seen, especially in African American, Hispanic communities, in terms of emotion, that stoicism aspect. There's this whole cultural emphasis on being male. It means to suppress your emotions, which, maybe that's great for movies and TV shows, but in the real world, that leads to more stress-related disorders, anxiety, things like that. And suppressed emotions also can negatively impact relationships, romantic, platonic, etc. Here's a comic kind of depicting some of these the problem with the male role. You can pause it and read through it if you'd like to here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go forward. More problems, also related sexual problems, obsession with sexual performance, this obsession with, all relationships, female relationships come down to sex. It creates undue anxiety. It creates tension. It also makes relationships confusing, especially confusing feelings of intimacy with sex. Sexualizing things like intimacy, like being vulnerable, also can lead to inappropriate anxiety when it comes to feeling, certain affections around other men, and perhaps even at a worst case, of this kind of thinking leads to homophobia, intolerance of homosexuality, or maybe even that sort of fear of being vulnerable to another man might, quote unquote, make you gay or something. I have no idea where that comes, I have an idea, but don't know why that still continues to exist. That's further from the truth. But you can kind of see how the dots connect. Expectations for females. There's a sort of marriage mandate, like in order to be the best version of yourself, you need to marry, get with someone else, get with a partner. There's also a motherhood mandate. Being female means having children. And these are also, however, within that lens, these expectations very much are focused on heterosexual success. This may not be the case for relationships, for non-heterosexual relationships. Also, there's sort of expectation of working outside of the home. In some instances, this is encouraged. In other cases, maybe it's not, in terms of what role the family life plays in all of this. So what are the problems with this sort of female role way of thinking? One, it diminishes career aspirations. You're more likely to see young women continue to have lower career aspirations than their young male counterparts when you have comparable backgrounds. This is called the ability achievement gap. Even though there's not necessarily a gap in ability, females can do all of the things that men can do in terms of success and achievement, but there's still a gap in that achievement. So you're also likely to see many women worrying that they'll be seen as less feminine if they are more successful, and it makes it more difficult, for example, to attract a mate. Another interesting problem for adopting or being, part of that female role is juggling multiple social roles. Having a career and being a mother, having this, wanting it all. Typically that leads to more conflict, specifically in the workplace and in the family life for women than it does for men. Most men have kind of one major responsibility, and that is go to work, bring home the bacon, so to speak. Whereas for women, if they're working, you have the responsibility of being an employee, like working, being a spouse, being a mother, all of those things. And a lot of times being able to juggle that, maybe one of those three things suffers, or two of those things suffer because you're so busy trying to juggle all three. So this is this picture is not uncommon, having a working mom who is working from home, taking care of children at the same time, and maintaining a career. More problems when it comes to the female role, these stereotypical views of the female role, these gender role expectations. There's ambivalence about sexuality. There are, at least socially speaking, there are, women who have problems enjoying sex, and it could be for many reasons. One, very early on, girls are taught to deny or suppress sexual feelings. It's boys who are sexually aggressive, not females. Girls are taught to emphasize pursuing romance over sexual experience. Sex is associated with fear of pregnancy and even sometimes pain. So there's a totally different perspective about sex for females than males. Okay, gender, looking at gender past in the past and in the future. After this section, you'll be able to explain the basis for traditional gender roles and why they're changing, define gender role identity, and discuss two alternatives to traditional gender roles, and discuss gender variance, including transgender and gender fluidity. As I mentioned at the top, it's not black and white, it's not binary anymore. We know there's much more fluidity to it. So begs the question, why are these roles changing? We talked about at the very beginning of the chapter, the fluidity of gender has been evolving probably since the 80s and even probably further than that, to be honest. Historically speaking, gender roles have resulted from division of labor. If we go all the way back and thinking about like hunting and gathering societies, men typically were the hunters, women typically were nurturing, gathering, maybe gathering fruit, things like that. So this gender role expectation started very early on in our ancestral history. Those traditional gender roles, however, don't make a lot of economic sense. For example, we aren't hunting and gathering. Most societies in the world are not hunting and gathering. We live in advanced economies where machinery has replaced manual labor, things like that. So a lot has changed in terms of economics. Some alternative explanations to those traditional gender roles, that identity, your identification, whether it be those qualities of being masculine, being feminine. We're seeing a growing push for people not wanting to conform to those typical gender roles, and are trying to kind of break free from the chains of those gender identity, stereotypes. Typically, we see if couples are adhering to those traditional gender role identities, especially in heterosexual couples, we tend to see lower satisfaction in their relationship. So we're starting to see more of a push towards androgyny, the coexistence of both masculine and feminine personality traits within a single person. Androgynous individuals tend to be less restrictive in terms of their behavior. They tend to function more flexibly, more fluidly in society. And then, typically when you have a partner who is androgynous or feminine, there, tends to be higher satisfaction within the relationships. So in terms of, masculinity, femininity, scoring high on both, being androgynous, whereas you scored low on one or low on the other, be more masculine or feminine. Other alternatives sort of transcending this idea of gender. The androgyny does have limitations. Maybe a more nuanced understanding is the gender role transcendence perspective, which says moving beyond gender roles is a way of helping us understand and perceive ourselves more compassionately. So instead of dividing us up based on characteristics like masculine and feminine, we should start thinking about gender neutral terms such as instrumental or expressive. And then so thinking about that sort of the gender variance, there's a lot of research that looks into this. Researchers are now growing area of interest is gender variance or gender non-conformity rather than those traditional gender labels. And as we understand more about like LGBTQ plus individuals, we know also part of that means knowing more about transgender individuals who their sense of their gender identity differs from what they're assigned at birth. So, maybe they identify as female, but they're born biologically male or vice versa. And this is an outward attempt to reject those gender labels. And we're seeing much more of a push towards gender fluidity. This idea that gender is mostly a continuum and it can also vary over time. Okay, last sort of topic we're going to look at is the role of gender plays in the workplace. At the end of this section, you will be able to describe sexism and explain benevolent sexism, discuss two forms of economic discrimination, describe the glass ceiling and explain what might account for it, define sexual harassment and describe two forms of it, and explain some characteristics and targets, discuss the effects of sexism and harassment, as well as ways to reduce each. So what is sexism? It's discrimination based upon someone's gender. However, sexism is not always equal. There is benevolent sexism, and it's sort of this idea that they're a positive feeling towards an individual. You treat the person kindly, but you're doing it in a way that's based on their gender. Like it's women are helpless and I need to open doors for them and I need to, lift heavy things for them. Like, sure, that's nice. Like you're being nice to those people, but you're doing it out of a mostly sexist reason. You think, oh, they're not capable of opening their own doors or lifting their own heavy stuff or whatever. This also, sexism takes place in economic discrimination, specifically two ways. Differential access to jobs. Women are less likely to hold positions where there are decision-making aspects to their job. And then when they're on the job, they're more likely to be treated differently, earning lower salaries, for example, that wage gap difference in the same job. We also see the existence of what is called the glass ceiling, an unseen sort of sociological barrier that prevents women from, and also ethnic minorities, not just women, from moving up in a profession. So you tend to see for men, it's more of the glass elevator where they're more likely to move up in a pretty consistent linear pattern. Whereas this glass ceiling, it's more likely to stifle growth, career growth for women, and it stems from negative evaluations, that are based on gender stereotypes. So, it has real world consequences in the workplace and how, whether or not, people have access to better paying jobs, better jobs overall. Another aspect of gender in the workplace is sexual harassment. And this is, any kind of contact, whether it's, verbal, physical, whatever, that is unwelcomed, and it's based on gender. You have quid pro quo, sexual harassment. Basically, if I do this, do this for me, sexual favor for me, and I'll give you a raise, I'll give you a promotion, I'll give you the job, whatever. Obviously, that's very problematic. But then there's also hostile work environment harassment, and this might be, sexist remarks, comments, things like that, making somebody uncomfortable in the workplace with the kind of, maybe culture that's created. Who are the targets of harassment? Both men and both women. Women are seen as more vulnerable, and women are seen as stronger, are more often the targets of harassment. It doesn't matter, whether or not. Women overall just tend to be more victims of harassment. That women who have experienced more interpersonal violence or gone against gender role expectations are more likely to be harassed. Like if you go against the grain, minority women are also more likely to be harassed than white women or men in the same workplace. What are the effects of discrimination, sexism in the workplace? Perceiving that discrimination takes place is related to depression, distress, stress response, just overall just lower quality of life, lower quality of satisfaction in work. Sexual harassment is related to lower job satisfaction, less engagement, poorer physical, mental health, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. What can we do to reduce sexual harassment and sexism in the workplace? Provide opportunities for success for disadvantaged groups, and have more transparent policies in terms of hiring and promotion, and also having a very clearly stated, trained, zero tolerance policy when it comes to diversity, reporting violations, things like that. So that's going to do it for this chapter. This is one of our longer chapters, but I think it's a really cool one to talk about. It's a really important subject that's very relevant and important. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments or on Canvas. Otherwise, I'll see you around for chapter 12. Take care. Bye.